This week on Business Mike, the business of communication. My guest today is Mimi Kalinda. She's the co-founder and managing director of Africommunications Group, a public relations and communications agency based in Johannesburg, South Africa. In this episode, Mimi shares some insight from her book, Talking to Africa, on how to effectively communicate to various African countries and some of the things to look out for when crafting a message for different African cultures. All this and more, next on Business Mike.
You're listening to the Business Mike podcast, amazing interviews with inspiring entrepreneurs. For more amazing interviews, go to www.businessmike.com or download our podcast every Monday from Pod Africa.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Business Mike. My name is Daudi and joining me today is Mimi. Mimi, can you just let the listeners know a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Hi, Daudi. Thank you so much for having me. So my name is Mimi Kalinda, and I am the managing director and co-founder of Africommunications Group, ACG, and we are an African-owned Pan-African public relations and communications firm based in Johannesburg and servicing the rest of the continent.
Right. And what led you to start Africommunications Group? Was it something you were always doing, or was there something that happened in your life that made you think, this is something I need to start?
I think, I've been in public relations for a number of years, so I had a really good understanding of communications in the African context, first of all. But also I felt that there was a gap that our competitors were not covering, and that is communications that is culturally sensitive and that is culturally attuned to the markets in which our clients operate. So I started ACG with that in mind, to say, and I said to myself, how do I then take my knowledge in communications and public relations and my knowledge of African markets, first of all, being an African myself, but also having traveled quite extensively across the continent, how do I combine that to offer my clients and potential clients a service that ensures that their audiences, the people they speak to and their stakeholders, are confident that they indeed understand the African context in which they work.
Right, and that's a very good point, and it's in fact why I wanted to chat with you, is because of the way African businesses and economies basically promote themselves and the way they're perceived. A very simple example would be, I had a conversation with Mami Ajay. She's an actress in Ghana, and she was wondering why Africans don't travel as much within Africa as they do outside Africa, because your average African will know pretty much everything about London, but they might not know the tourist attractions in Senegal or other African countries, and yet, if properly marketed, these would be destinations that we ourselves would happily go to.
Precisely. It is a huge gap in the market. It's a huge gap in the narrative. But I also think that, thankfully, these things are changing. I don't think that there was ever a time in history when Africans were as optimistic about their continent as they are today, where they are as curious, where they are as capable of getting excited about African brands as they are today. So as much as I think that there is still a lot of work to be done, I do think that we are in a very enthusiastic, exciting space in terms of what it means to be African, to consume African goods and services, and also to travel the continent of our ancestors and to learn a little bit more about who we are as a result.
Right, and you recently published a book called Talking to Africa. Can you just let us know a bit about what the book is basically based on?
Talking to Africa is a book that takes what we do as a company, as ACG, one step further, and really delves deep into the cultural dynamics and nuances of 4 African markets, which are Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, and Ethiopia. And looks at things like, how do people perceive the notion of family? How do people perceive gender? How do people perceive religion? What does wealth, the concept of wealth, mean to various populations in those markets. Now, once you understand the cultural context and baggage that people bring to a brand, then you're able to customize your communication strategy accordingly so that you can start to incentivize these audiences and your stakeholders to action vis-a-vis your brand. And that was the premise of the book.
Right. So, for instance, if, say, I'm someone in Ethiopia and I want to market my product or brand to Nigeria, it's one thing for any of those brands to market outside Africa because there's a perception about Africa from the outside looking in. But within Africa, for instance, putting out a piece of cloth with African print isn't enough because very many African countries have African print. There has to be something extra. What advice would you give a business or a service trying to market itself within Africa that's African? So basically their unique selling points outside Africa don't necessarily apply within Africa.
So, I don't know if our unique selling points outside of Africa don't necessarily apply inside the continent. So if we take the example that you've given of an Ethiopian brand or somebody selling a product or service from Ethiopia and trying to penetrate the Nigerian market, some of the things that they would have to know and understand about Nigeria are the same things that any other brand worldwide would need to know. First of all, we all know about the demographics of Nigeria, Africa's biggest market in terms of demographic, but there are such cultural nuances in Nigeria. One of the things that I found in my research while I was writing the book is that Nigerians really want products that are customized to Nigeria. The sense of cultural identity in Nigeria is so strong that despite the fact that with urbanites, you have some penetration of Western values and Western culture, the Nigerian culture still remains, very authentic. So doing the research and understanding, what is the difference between, an Igbo and a Yoruba person, for example. A lot of us in Africa don't even understand those things, a very basic level. Understanding where the country has come from a political, economic, and socioeconomic context that has brought them to where they are. And then customizing the product itself and the service and injecting, I suppose, what I would call, quote unquote, some Nigerianness in the brand, so that people can relate to that service or product at their own level, is extremely important. But I do think that there are best practices that we can take from products that are coming from the outside world, from the U.S., from China, or even from Europe, who come to Africa and try and create market share in this part of the world. I think that there are best practices that we can definitely source from them, but I think the overall key is to customize and localize.
Right. That obviously means you can't copy and paste a working template.
That's right. I think copy and paste is, is really goes against the principles of not generalizing, not making assumptions, and not having a stereotypical approach and point of view when it comes to the African continent, because it's impossible to do so and succeed. I'd like to say that you have 54 countries in Africa, but let's take one, the DRC. For example, the DRC is a huge country, second biggest on the continent, and but the people who live in the east of the DRC, Goma and other areas, probably have more in tune and more in common from the cultural point of view than people who live in Rwanda, in Uganda, in Burundi, etc., than they do with people who live in the same country in Kinshasa, the capital, for example. So then how do you communicate to those varying factions of a population that lives on the same territory but speaks different languages, eats different foods, etc.? So copy and paste really doesn't work. And especially, you wouldn't necessarily copy and paste a campaign that was successful in New York to some of the places that I've referred to in the DRC, for example.
Right, and is that exactly what Africommunications Group does for clients? Do you basically help them understand what it is that's different between these two parts of the country and maybe help them craft a message that is effective?
Precisely. I think, everything starts with understanding the client's objectives and goals as a business. And from there, customizing a campaign, a messaging, a line of positioning for that specific client that takes into account the stakeholders that they're talking to. So there's a huge stakeholder mapping exercise that goes into that as well. To say, who are the people that you're trying to speak to? What are their demographic characteristics? And what would be the best way to speak to them in a language, in a format that they can understand best.
Right. And for anyone listening to this particular interview that perhaps is very keen on PR and maybe they want to start their own farm, what advice can you give them based on your experience with regards to building a farm from the ground up?
Join our firm. Why start a firm? No, I'm joking. Of course. I think, first of all, the key thing that you need is some sort of differentiating factor. And if you understand that the product that you're selling, first of all, our competitors are global competitors. So we're competing with global firms from New York, from St. Louis, and other places around the world, and who have sometimes had 50 plus years of experience in this field, more than we have. And so for us, being an African firm, understanding the continent, having traveled from Cairo to the Cape, and really having spoken to Africans in all sorts of contexts, whether it's in the rural areas or urban areas, that's been our differentiating factor. And we can confidently say that we know and understand Africa and therefore know how to communicate to our people. And so that would be my first piece of advice, is just understanding what your differentiating factor is, what your niche attractiveness is. And really capitalizing on that. And I think also, team is everything. Nobody can do anything alone. No man is an island. So surrounding yourself with people who understand your vision, because, in so many instances as an entrepreneur, especially on a continent as complex as ours, the opportunities and the temptation to give up are many. So I think to surround yourself with people who understand your vision, who support your vision, and who can help you to build a network, because obviously having a company is a beautiful thing, but having a company with no clients is not what we're aiming for.
Right, absolutely right. And are there any challenges you've had from a business perspective? Obviously, I have to look at your website, and you have multiple locations in very many countries. Were there any challenges in growing it to that scale?
I think one of the key challenges that we faced is mainly logistical, in the sense that, if you're dealing with a client, for example, that is doing work in Mozambique, Namibia, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, we have amazing partners in all of those places, but to move around Africa from one place to another is quite a challenge. And I've had sometimes to travel to Dakar and had to fly through Paris to get to Dakar, which, is quite ludicrous when you think about it. So the logistical part of doing business in Africa can be a huge challenge. I also think that sometimes people underestimate the cost of doing business in Africa. Which, if you're coming with huge pockets of money, from some of the most, quote unquote, developed parts of the world, and you're dealing in US dollars or pounds, etc., might not seem like much. But I think for the ordinary person, for this ordinary small business startup in Africa, the cost of doing business in Africa can be extremely high. And I think the third thing as well is, from a regulatory point of view, some of our African countries could have policies that make business development and being an entrepreneur, having a startup company on the continent a lot easier from an administrative and regulatory standpoint. I know that countries like Rwanda are doing a fantastic job at that. Kenya is also quite an open market, even though, again, I'll go back to the cost of doing business. Doing business in Kenya is very expensive. But I think we could all take a page out of that book and say, how can we, from a regulatory, from an admin, governmental standpoint, make it easier for African entrepreneurs to thrive?
And based on everything you've said, if you had a time machine and you could basically go back to the point when you're just starting Africommunications Group, knowing everything you know now, what advice or what cheat sheet would you give yourself?
What would I do better? I think that, what I would do better if I was given a time capsule and I could go back, is to probably spend even more time than I spent in some of these countries. I would have written my book a lot earlier, and I would have covered more countries and more markets, and I would have probably done it the other way around. So as opposed to starting a PR firm and as you're starting, collecting the data that you need about each one of your markets, et cetera, as your clients come in, I found that part of my passion in my work actually lies in the collection of data and insights. So I think having that repository of content and knowledge before going into kind of the business aspects of running the firm would have been my first stop. And I suppose that would be another piece of advice that I would give young entrepreneurs. Spend as much time as you need doing your research, not just about, the business side of running a firm, but about the products that you're selling. The more research and the more knowledge you have about what it is that you're selling, the better your chances of succeeding.
Right. And to that point, how has the book and the business, how have they worked in terms of synergy? Because I know very many people that write books who do so in the hope that the book will give them a platform on which to become a speaker or a consultant, something of the sort. Has the book in some way elevated the business, or has the business elevated the book? I'm not sure which way it's gone in your case.
I think it's been both, to be honest. Just to give you some context, the book I really wrote because it was a personal passion. And in fact, I started collecting material for the book before the idea of starting ACG even came about. And I did not even tell my business partners that I was writing this book until it was done. They kind of found out, like everybody else, that I'd written this book. So it was a personal passion that I wanted to pursue. But as it turns out, I think that the book has helped to position the firm, as a thought leading firm, which we were regarded. And also the firm has, it has given me an opportunity to leverage the content that I have in the book, to use it to the benefit of the clients that we currently have.
Final question. If you were stranded on a desert island and you had an opportunity to take one item of each, if you could take one book, one movie, and one song, what book, what movie, and what song would you take with you?
Oh, my goodness. Well, first of all, I planned on starting a book called Swing Time, and I have not, by the author of White Teeth and On Beauty, and I have not started it because I've been so busy for the last couple of weeks. So I have it here, and I'm waiting to start it, so that will probably be the book that I take with me. In terms of a song, I'm going through a phase at the moment where I am very big on Nigerian music, as I'm thinking the rest of the continent is as well, clearly.
Yeah.
So I would probably take some Nigerian music with me. In terms of a movie, oh my goodness, that is a very, very hard one. I think I would take anything with Denzel Washington in it, just because I really I love his work. I've worked with him before. And I love his work ethic, and I just think he's an amazing actor. So anything with Denzel Washington, I would probably watch.
Oh, you've worked with him. How does it come across as an individual and as a professional?
Denzel Washington is amazing. I was working as a production assistant on the film called Inside Man, which you might remember came out a couple of years ago, directed by Spike Lee in New York. And one of the most impressive things I've ever seen in terms of somebody's work ethic was, I don't know if you remember, at the beginning of the movie, Denzel Washington and his partner, he's a police officer, and his partner come out of the car. They arrive at the scene of this bank robbery, and they come out of the car, and their job is to basically walk to where the bank robbery is taking place so that they can get briefed on what's happened so far. And I think, I cannot remember the exact amount of times we filmed that specific bit and how many takes we had to do for that bit where he gets out of the car, but it was a lot. I was hidden behind a pillar in downtown Manhattan, not too far from where the car was, and I just kept hearing, cut, let's do it again, cut, let's do it again. And it wasn't because Denzel was kind of messing up or doing anything like that. It wasn't because any member of the crew hadn't captured something they were supposed to capture. It was because he felt that he could do better. And this was it's a 30-second clip in the whole movie. But we did it again and again because for him, where he was looking when he got out of the car was important. How he walked, where his body turned, his body language, etc. And he has no lines here. But, all of these things that he was so aware of and wanted to do to perfection was really quite astounding. And so that specific moment for me just showed me that, one, having a really strong work ethic is extremely important in becoming successful. And that the second thing is, it doesn't matter how great you become and how well you do. You never stop learning, and you should never stop working and becoming even more excellent. Because this is an Academy Award winning actor who really, really cares about the details. And so that was a huge lesson for me.
Wow. Well, I can't thank you enough, Mimi, for joining us today on Business Mike. We've learned quite a bit from you. Can you just let the listeners know how they can connect with you online and on social media?
Absolutely. So online, our website is www.africommunicationsgroup.com. On Twitter, I am at Mimi Kalinda. And that's it.
Well, thank you once again, Mimi, and all the best with Africommunications Group.
Thank you very much, Dowdy. Thanks for having me. Great talking to you.
Thanks for listening to the Business Mike podcast. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you'd like to listen to more episodes just like this one, simply go to businessmike.com. I would love to hear from you. So if you've got any questions or feedback, you can reach me on Twitter at Dowdy Mugabe, on Facebook at Business Mike, or email, that's dowdy@businessmike.com. Don't forget, we have a brand new episode every Monday. And until then, take care.